my chosen sport is bodybuilding. I'm an athlete first. So I've kind of just pivoted with the restrictions, and I've changed what I was doing. So previously I was in a strength gain phase, so doing a lot of deadlifts, a lot of very low volume work. And since then I've kind of transitioned across to being more cardiovascular sprints, long distance running. About a week ago, I actually completed a half marathon for the first time in my life, just because I'm like, got to train for something, right? So I may as well take the opportunity and work on it. And I think, you know, from what I've seen of your own history with sport, you're much the same, you know what I mean? Like you might be able to specialize in a particular activity, but you're an athlete first.
Yeah, no, definitely. I, you know, it's kind of one of those things where I was never really good at one thing. I mean, even though when I was competing in powerlifting, I was never particularly good one rep max lifter. I mean, you know, I deadlifted close to 800 pounds, you know, as a drug-free athlete, which is decent, but I never felt that one rep maxes were my absolute best point. I've always been better at more repetition-based stuff. And so that's why I think I gravitate toward the rowing and, you know, that type of stuff. So, but yeah, I mean, I like to maintain a bunch of skills, and then you kind of specialize when you need to, but you still don't want to sacrifice all that other stuff.
It's interesting. I think when I was younger, I was very drawn to the idea of being specialist. You know, I'd always turn my nose up at things like CrossFit, because it'd be like, you know, jack of all trades, master of none. Why would you want to limit yourself like that? But I suppose as I've gotten a little bit older, the idea of being a hybrid athlete appeals to me more and more. You know, the idea that you can just get up and you can just do something. You know, and I think a lot of people here probably feel the same way in terms of what this diet does for them, because, you know, you just feel so much more enabled as a person. Like you can just eat something, you know what I mean? Like you just know what you eat, so you just eat it. Or, you know, you've just got the energy to go out and go play with your kids, or, you know, just that general quality of life improvement that comes with it. Just bringing you back to meat again. But that's kind of how I feel about exercise now. You know, I want to perform at a really high level at pretty much everything I do, because that's the kind of perfectionist person I am. But rather than specializing in any one activity, I feel like I'm drawn in. I want to be good at as many things as possible now.
Yeah, it's fun. Like I said, I've recently sort of started messing around with the CrossFit type stuff, and even though I'm not at all, you know, not suited for it from a body type standard at all, but I'm doing it.
Yeah.
Having fun with that. All right, let's get into the carnivore diet. You did that. I remember when I talked to you, you did a very high protein version. You got very, very you talked about, you know, you were probably putting out quite a bit of ammonia maybe. And where are you at now with regard to that stuff? I know you said you backed off the really lean stuff, and you really had a hard time putting on much body fat. You kind of like, you know, there was kind of like a point where you were just like, you couldn't get much more fat on you.
For background for everyone else, I actually got told that I needed to put on some body fat, which I suppose is a good problem to have. But I decided I'd actually experiment with trying to eat a higher fat carnivore approach. And what was really interesting about it was that up until that point, I'd always been a very loud proponent for a high protein approach. And although I turn around and say that I won't tell anyone whose diet is working for them that they're wrong, I'd also be very convicted that I was right. So I went through and I started trying to overeat fatty meat, specifically put on weight. Now, like, full disclosure, I did gain body fat. What was really interesting about it though was that I gained a lot less fat than what I thought I should have. And I kind of reached a point, it would have been about 19-20% body fat, which is still considered very lean, I suppose, where no matter how much I ate, I just could not put on any more body fat. Now, I'm not really sure 100% what the mechanism was, what was behind that. I wasn't counting calories at the time, so from a scientific perspective, I can't say that I was in a surplus, but I certainly felt like I was in a surplus. The idea of eating became repulsive. I didn't want to do it anymore. My body just wouldn't. It was honestly like a full-time job trying to put on body fat. I ended up having to resort to adding monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fatty acids, predominantly through things like pork fat, chicken fat, and then eventually even adding nut butters and avocado and things like that, trying to ram some calories down, which solved the problem. But it was an interesting experience realizing that no matter how hard I tried, my body fat would settle around, that 19 to 20% mark, which I think everyone here can agree is a very healthy perspective. You know what I mean? There was no point where I gained so much weight that I was having health effects. Also at the time, I was actually going through a strength phase. So I was specifically trying to gain strength in my squat. And I actually saw the largest gains in squat weight moved that I've ever seen in my career. So to give a perspective, I actually gained overall a total of just about what would have been 30, 40 pounds. I'm doing the math in my head, not very good at it, which may not sound like a lot, but when you're already squatting, in the 2 times your body weight kind of range already, when you're like right up the upper edge of what your body can do naturally, gaining that kind of weight is actually a huge performance increase. Even things like my cardiovascular capacity, I wasn't doing a lot, but things like sprinting or other high output activities, which were generally considered to be glycolytic, I felt like my endurance was much, much higher, which is interesting because it implies that my ability to oxidize fatty acids for energy was increased even though I was doing a glycolytic activity. So I don't know, that was kind of my experience with it.
Yeah, I don't know I know you like to pay attention to some of the literature. I don't know if you saw Kevin Hall's latest preprint that just came out yesterday talking
Yeah,
about
I read it already.
And the interesting thing there was, despite 700 extra calories in the ketogenic group, they failed to gain any body weight. In fact, lost body weight relative to the folks that were on the low-fat plant-based diet who lost a little bit. And there was a slight difference in lean body mass, and that was mostly water, glycogen, and intestinal contents and fat.
So there was a couple of ideas that came up about this, right? Yeah. First of all, sorry to interrupt. First of all, when you say that you have a protein matched diet between a plant-based and a meat-based diet, they're not protein matched. Or rather, if they are protein matched, their absorbed amino acid load are not. So like that in itself, you can already tell that a meat-based diet has a metabolic advantage because there's a greater amount of digested energy that is coming from a bioavailable protein. And as we already know, every diet intervention that is higher in protein for any given energy intake results in favorable body composition changes.
Yes, I mean, and that's a recent study they did a study on that looking at the plant-based versus animal-based protein isolates, and when they did a match study, they saw that the bioavailable amino acids in the serum were much higher, I think 40% higher in the animal base. So yeah, I mean protein match, but I mean like I said, and I try to put this in the frame of a carnivore diet. None of us are eating 15% of our calories from protein. I would say most of us are probably looking at 30%, maybe even more for some of us. So I mean, yeah, that's not even that's and Kevin Hall's justification. Well, it was a well-formulated ketogenic diet as advocated by Steve Finney and so on and so forth and Bird Health. And so I said that may be true, but it doesn't really jive with what I consider an animal-based diet. I do think protein is a huge advantage metabolically for not gaining weight and maintaining lean body mass. So it'd be interesting to see if they did that study and used the appropriate amount of protein, because I don't know if there's a law that we have to protein match different diets. If you go on a whole food plant-based diet, a la Michael Greger, Garth Davis, Joel Kahn, what's his name, the Starchivore guy. I mean, you're going to be on a relatively lower protein diet. Maybe you're 15% of your calories. If you go on an animal-based carnivorous diet, your protein is going to be much higher. So I don't know that there's a need to protein match those two cohorts. I mean, if we're looking at real world and what people are advocating. So
well, I mean, here's the other thing as well. Like if you go ahead and you do actually quote unquote protein match, and by that I mean bioavailable protein, then you're artificially removing the advantage that a meat-based diet represents, which in itself is unrealistic. You're essentially cherry picking data to alter the results to get what you're after. Your total calorie intake would be higher. Sorry, correction. even if your total percentage of protein intake for a given calorie load, if they were protein matched across plant-based versus meat-based diet, means that there'd have to be a higher percentage coming from protein in a plant-based in order to adapt for the bioavailability. So already, like, it just strikes me as trying to stack the deck to show a result that you're after, rather than being honest about real-world results.
Right. And the other thing is, I mean, you lock people in a metabolic ward and say, here are your options. Here's some quinoa salad and, bean salad, eat as much as you want. I mean, and you don't give them, like I said, I think if it would have been, we have access to whatever food, you can eat plant-based junk food, plant-based whole food, animal-based junk food, of which there really isn't that much if you really exclude plants from there. And, animal-based, you might dairy, some people would argue dairy would be, like people could binge on cheese. That would be more applicable to the real world, even though it's metabolic. Because if I'm locked up and they say you're on a plant-based diet, all you got is this quinoa, I'm not going to eat much. I'm just like, this is not very palatable. So therefore, I'm going to tend to not eat much. But if you say, here's quinoa, and by the way, there's Oreos in the cupboard if you want some of those, I'm probably going to eat my quinoa and then I'm going to go eat some Oreos because I'm still.
Well, have you done much research into the effect of altering energy density on total energy intake in a diet?
I've read, a few of the studies on there. I don't know what point you're looking. I know they're talking about energy density in the context of satiety, but we've seen that.
Yeah, I think energy density is an argument. So I'm going to circle back to your point. I think energy density is one of the major arguments that most vegans will make at some point. And it's interesting because if you look at short interventional studies, people who do follow a lower energy density diet do end up consuming lower energy intake in total. But what's really interesting is that only works if people aren't given the opportunity to compensate for their diet later. So what I mean by that is that if you give one person a meal of a low energy density diet and then release them out into the wild, they'll actually go hunting for high energy density foods. But if you restrict them, so they can only eat from the menu that you give them, or they self-restrict through diet, then yes, lowering your energy density does actually decrease your energy intake, but people tend to experience cravings. Now, what that's relevant to a vegan, I suppose, diet or a vegetarian diet is that although they are lowering their energy density in their diet, it only works because their only food options are low energy density starvation food. You know what I mean? So they're artificially restricting themselves to that low energy density food. What's really interesting about it is it's not just low energy density, it's also low nutrient density, as much as people might want to argue that point. So again, I could make a couple of, I'd like to think, strong counter arguments, but veganism and vegetarian diets only really work if you are absolutely devout about it. The moment that you start allowing things like dark chocolate or nuts or other things like that straight into the diet again, all that ends up happening is that people end up compensating for the energy that they'd not eaten in a previous meal by overeating high energy density foods at a later meal.
Yeah, I think that's I think that's the case. I mean, anybody who's gone on a the salad leafy green diet and then finds them at 2 a.m. in the fridge, downing a pint of ice cream. knows that feeling. You can only do it for so long, and then you just kind of fall apart there. So tell us about you've experimented with different strategies, carbohydrate. What are you doing with carbohydrates right now? How are you utilizing those, or are you utilizing those?
So I say this in the context, again, of being an athlete. So this isn't necessarily applicable to everyone who's listening to this combo. So I train twice a day, doing a cardiovascular and then some form of resistance or explosive work in the afternoon. So with that volume of work that I'm doing, I can't actually sustain exercise performance without replacing a certain amount of glycogen to enable the next training session. Generally speaking, I recommend that people supplement with glucose only if the amount of glycogen that they've depleted in a training session cannot be replenished through gluconeogenesis before the next training session. So if I was to train legs on Monday and they wouldn't have replenished muscle glycogen by my next training session, let's say I'm doing sprints on, I don't know, Tuesday morning instead, then yes, I would supplement with a little bit of glucose in order to compensate. What I normally aim for is about 0.15 grams per pound of lean body mass, which for me ends up being about 21 to 24 grams worth of glucose straight after the training session. And I find that's just enough to bump up my ability to perform in the next session by replacing the glycogen. The other major use for it, and again, I'm talking about this from a body compositional perspective rather than a health perspective, is that as you get leaner and leaner, the cravings that you experience in an energy deficit increase. That's largely modulated by decreased leptin, and then obviously that's effect on ghrelin and peptide YY, CCK, etc., the rest of the satiety hormones. But the downstream effect of it is that generally liver glycogen gets depleted when your body fat isn't sufficient in order to support you in your deficit. In those instances, a small amount of glucose, particularly before bed, and preferably actually from fructose. So I tend to recommend fresh berries. Can actually get rid of a lot of the cravings that people experience from a higher protein, lower fat diet when they are lean, just simply because of the effect of being lean and getting leaner. Does that make sense?
No, I understand. I definitely understand that where that could potentially be helpful.
Yeah.
What about, so just back to, because when I interviewed you, I was quite astounded with talk about the quantity, because you are, you know, not a giant person. You're a female. I mean, you've got a fair bit of muscle on you, but you were eating, you know, two plus kilos a day off 5 pounds of meat. At some point, correct?
Yep. So I eat anywhere between 2 and 4 meals a day. If I'm trying to gain weight, which I was when we were talking, I would generally eat 2 to 3 meals, and each time I was eating between just over a pound and 2 pounds in a sitting. Breakfast I'd normally eat a little bit more, and then so I might have like 2 pounds for breakfast, and then a pound for lunch, and then a pound again for dinner, or maybe 2 pounds for dinner. So I was eating a lot of meat.
And was that more than what you'd eating prior when you were on a standard bodybuilding diet? And was this an increase in volume for you?
I would still, it's hard. It's so hard to be able to equate them across. Like when I was on a standing bodybuilding diet, my diet consisted of, it's sad that I can still recall this, but 3 meals in total of 200 grams of chicken, 150 grams of rice, broccoli. So I'd have that for my lunch, afternoon tea, dinner meal. For bedtime, I'd have half a tub of cottage cheese with a handful of berries. My morning tea meal was 250 grams worth of Greek yogurt with exactly 45 almonds, and then breakfast was half a cup of oats made on the skim milk with sugar-free maple syrup. So it's really hard to equate the volume of food following that kind of diet versus now where it's like grab steak, cook steak, eat steak, you know, like.
Yeah, and I kind of chuckle here. You said exactly 45 almonds.
You know what? Okay, I've actually got distinct memories of buying the dry roasted almonds, because at the time, like, they're like the one source of happiness in your diet when you're eating chicken, broccoli, and rice, without like extra salt, because God forbid you have sodium, right? And like you'd be counting out like the 45 fucking almonds for like 10. Such a waste of time.
Yeah, and we all done some of us have done that kind of craziness. What about you talk about salt? What are your thoughts on salt these days? Are you a high salt person, low salt person?
Okay, let's be really pragmatic. If you don't have salt, eventually you'll get cravings and then you'll have something salty, right? And your body will maintain homeostasis. If you really, 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 really overload the salt, you'll just weird out. Like, I don't see the problem. And I don't understand why people get so, I suppose, tribal about it. Like, if you like salt, eat salt. If you don't like salt, don't eat salt.
Yeah, I think there is a mechanism, a feedback mechanism that just talked about with salt, a lot of us. And, most of us that are on a hyper processed diet are used to eating this tremendous salt cuts in all the food. And then when you go to a whole food diet, whether it's carnivore diet or some other one, the salt content tends to be pretty low, and therefore you may have to add in. There are people in the carnivore diet that take no salt whatsoever. Many of them, a lot of people fail to realize that meat has sodium in it. I mean, it's not
Well,
like,
exactly. And the thing is, the human body is a fantastic machine at maintaining homeostasis. Um, I think what's a lot more important than any particular total grammage amount is actually the ratio between different electrolytes. And like, for example, people within my community would worry about the sodium being too high, but that's because they're not eating enough potassium. If they were eating sufficient potassium, then, water retention from a high sodium diet wouldn't be a problem. Similarly, if you don't have a lot of salt, all that ends up happening is your body becomes very good at preserving the sodium intracellularly and releasing only the small amounts that it needs to support it. If you're eating a lot of salt all the time, your body just gets used to winging it out. It's not really the total amounts of the problem. I think it's just the ratios between sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium, and the rest of them.
yeah, we had Rob Wolf on the other day talking about it. He seems like sodium tends to be the driver of the main driver of the situation there. So like I said, once this lockdown in Australia is over, or in the US or
Mm-hmm.
wherever, I mean, it seems like maybe it's coming to happen in the near future. What are you planning on doing as far as physique, performance? What is your goal at this point?
Well, I mean, I'm actually open to some advice. Maybe you guys can give me a hand, put in some comments down the bottom. But I'm of two minds. So I miss being a physique athlete in a lot of ways. The culture can be very toxic, but at the same time, the community in itself can also be very supportive. And I think, that's pretty much true of everywhere you go. But at the same time, having done the sport for a period of time, it does feed into a lot of eating disordered behavior. So I'm a little bit concerned about going back and competing again and going through a period of 3 to 4 months worth of heavy restriction and achieving very unhealthy levels of body fat. So that on one hand, I want to get back into physique competing, but on the other side, I'm starting to think, well, maybe I should try and celebrate my body for what it can do rather than what it looks like. Maybe getting into something more along the lines of powerlifting, or even, competitive CrossFit or something. I know I want to compete in something, but I suppose I just feel like I'm a bit of a crossroads around which direction I take that competition, I guess. I mean, what's everyone else's thoughts?
I'll see if they want to type things. I know from my personal thing, I find that after about 5 to 7 years, I kind of stagnate in whatever sport I'm in, and I need to change it just for the mental change that it brings, and the different sort of competitiveness. And so, like I said, I had done powerlifting for years and strongman
Mm-hmm.
for years, and then throwing, Highland Games, and then I was rowing.
Travis says BJJ.
Yeah, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, and then somebody said they want to see me compete in CrossFit. Yeah, that's my goal. I mean, like I said, I think it's going to take me 2 years to reach sufficient level of proficiency at certain exercises where I can be competitive. I mean, I think some things I've already got things that I can do very well, but there are a lot of things I can't, and that's the fun
Yeah.
about that. And there's a lot of things I'm never going to be the top at just because of Yeah.
And it's interesting you mentioned the 5 to 7 year cycle. I mean, like I'm 29, so I've had time to do like one, maybe two. But I think once you've done an activity for that period of time, you know, you again are at a bit of a crossroads. You either continue it and try to get into the elite level, if you've got the genetic predisposition or the talent, I suppose, to be able to make it to that elite level, or alternatively, you just accept the fact that you're getting pretty close to the max that you're going to be able to achieve and either be happy with that or find a new activity. And it sounds like you're the kind of person who chooses to find a new activity.
Well, I mean, I've fortunately made it to world championship level and national championship level in several sports, you know, and I find that like with strongman, I realized, I mean, even though I went to the first ever national strongman championships and placed fifth, but I quickly realized without drugs, I was not going to be at the top of that sport. So I said, no, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to take drugs. And so I've selected other sports to try, which I was able to achieve. And granted, some of this has been master's level, and you see old people just suck. I mean, they just, I mean, they're, you know, I mean, your level of competition goes down pretty tremendously after a certain age. I mean, the people that are able to, willing to, they're healthy enough to continue to compete. And so it gets a little easier as you get older. But so, you know, there's that there. But let me ask you again, when you got lean as a carnivore, and I've heard this from a number of people that they said it was easier. And I know a lot of people, one of the things that I currently am doing, because in the interest of getting leaner for CrossFit, because being 6'5" and 240 pounds is not really a good size for a CrossFit athlete. I need to be 15, 20 pounds lighter. I intentionally leaned out, in which I wasn't, you know, I was just eating for performance, and that meant higher body fat. So for me to lean out, I just started, you know, eating leaner cuts of meat, and then I would cycle back in fats on a periodic basis. And it's relatively comfortable. I'm maintaining a relatively low level of body fat without being miserable. But I know a lot of people, like particularly women in general, when they get down to these low body fat, you know, when they start getting around, you know, 13, 12, 11, 10% body fat, they start really not doing well with regard to hormone function, you know, and a whole bunch of other things. Did you see a contrast in getting leaner on a carnivore style approach versus the standard bodybuilding style approach with regard to that stuff?
So I'm just writing down a point so I can come back to it. So to answer your question directly, first of all, yes. So cutting on a carnivore diet was much, much, much easier than following a different approach. I suppose there's a couple of reasons. From a psychological standpoint, it was a lot easier just having a selection of food to eat, you know, like have a steak or have some mince of a set fat percentage, rather than trying to count out 45 almonds and being tempted to have 47, or 160 grams of rice rather than 150. I think from a behavioral perspective, only having 2 to 3 larger meals per day, A, they were more satisfying, and B, there's only 2 or 3 opportunities to accidentally mess up versus 6 or 7 opportunities to mess up. So that was an add-in. The food itself was much more satisfying. The protein percentage that I was getting from a carnivore diet versus, I suppose, a traditional bodybuilding approach was much higher. So the quality of weight lost was a lot better. I didn't lose my menses until right at the very end on a carnivorous approach, which is something that I lose quite early, generally speaking. So for those who don't know, losing a period is pretty much par for the course in a bodybuilding competition, and it's always a risky gamble getting down that low, because a lot of girls will never get them back. So sorry, I was just thinking about a friend who had 6 or 7 years since her last comp. She's still not. But anyway, I never lost it until right near the very end, which was a huge benefit to me. Everything from my mood was better. I was a lot more stable across the board. Quality of fat lost was better. But from a putting up with suffering perspective, psychologically, I just found it was a million times easier for me to get that lean. The start of the prep was almost effortless. I didn't really feel like I was working until the back third. And I wouldn't say at any point I ever felt like I was suffering like I did on a normal prep.
Yeah, when you talk about the back third, I mean, what kind of, I mean, how did you do that? I mean, what was your sort of your practice? I mean, obviously there was some caloric restriction going on at some point, I would imagine. Did you have a plan on, I'm going to get contest shape, and generally those last 3 weeks, 4 weeks, some people are throwing in diuretics and, they get all the crazy stuff that's going on. And obviously there's drug usage for some people and that sort of stuff. But I mean, what was a dietary nutritional thing looking like as you got down to the nitty gritty type of stuff?
Okay. So to answer your question, reference timeline, I like to do a slightly longer prep. So I'll normally go for about 18 weeks. So when I say the back third, I'm really talking the last 6-week mesocycle. The reason I like to use 18 weeks because my mesocycles are 6 week long and I just plan 3 mesocycles for a prep. In terms of, sorry, could you confirm it? You asked a couple of questions. Could you confirm what you wanted to know?
I wanted to see what let's talk about the last 6 weeks. I mean, it's kind of relative to where you were the first 12 weeks.
Okay. So, for the first couple of weeks, I wasn't actually actively counting. I was just eating a higher protein approach, eating very lean cuts of meat, eating to satiety. That was netting me about 0.5% to about 0.75% of total body weight lost per week, which is spot on about what I'm looking for. That kind of stopped around the 8 or 9 week mark, which made sense. Like as you get leaner and leaner, you've really got 2 options as your hunger increases: either purposely restrict food or get progressively tighter with the food selection that you're getting on. And I kind of reached a natural point where I couldn't really get any tighter with my diet. And I had to start counting. So that was probably about maybe 9 weeks, 9 weeks out. By that stage, I dropped everything that wasn't meat. So I cut out protein shakes. I cut out all dairy. I cut out anything that whitened my coffee. I was literally just left with really lean meats, eating to satiety. So the only option I had then was to obviously start counting. So that's where I started moving across to doing 3 meals a day of 1/2 pound at a time. And this actually brings me around to a slightly different point. Actually, have you heard of the concept of G flux or energy flux? So this is actually really fascinating.
I have heard of the concept. I'm not sure in the context you're going to talk about though, so we'll see.
Okay, so I'll ask you this as a question. Which is more effective, right? You've got 2 diets, one where you're in a 500 calorie deficit, but you're only eating 1,500 calories, or another one where you're in a 500 calorie deficit, but you're eating 2,500 calories. Which is better?
Which is better for the purpose of losing weight and, well, I mean, I guess it would depend on the person's size, the person activity level. I would hope that you could eat more and, there's interesting studies that, that you adapt to a higher amount of food, I know with protein overfeeding studies, we see people, where they adapt to greater amounts of food and their basal metabolic rate basically goes up. And that's, I think Kevin Hall's study recent sort of showed that. But like I said, I would personally, better for sanity is a higher calorie diet. I think for most people, not is it more effective for weight loss? How low do you have to go? What is your previous metabolic resting rate? And if you're still in a deficit, it's a smaller percentage, right? So 500 calories off of a 2,500 calorie diet is less of a percentage than 500 calories off of so you'd be 3,000 to 2,500 versus 2,000 to 1,500. And so the percentage would be higher.
So there's actually some really, really fascinating studies about this. And actually one conducted a metabolic ward. So I'll talk about that one first. if they put two people in, well, a group of people, but they had two groups of people, right, in a metabolic ward. So they had a low calorie group who were kept sedentary and were on a like a set deficit per day, let's just say 1,000 per day, less calories than what they needed. They then had another group who were active, so they did a number of hours of exercise on a treadmill, God bless them, and maintained the same deficit but ate much more food. And what they did is they looked at the body compositional differences across the group. So exactly the same deficits, one was just eating more food versus the other. And what they found is that although the weight lost was exactly matched, or at least not significant between groups, the quality of weight that lost was much higher in the high energy flux group. What that means is that if you create an energy deficit through exercise versus creating the deficit through just purely restricting food, the amount of weight that's lost from fat versus muscle mass is much higher. Similarly, they found that the group who were on the, this is in a different study now, but a group that was on a high energy flux deficit experienced significantly lower amounts of hunger, they had higher satiety, that like overall they just felt better on the diet. I think that the greater amount of food that you eat, the more opportunity that you're giving your body to be able to actually gain the nutrients that it needs from that given amount of food. Which just, I don't know how I can comment on that. That just makes sense. The other thing I found as well with athletes that I've coached before is that, you know, and coming back through to the loss of menses again, I found that athletes who manage to lose weight at a higher energy flux tend to keep their flow each month versus women who are heavily restrictive on a low energy density diet. They tend to lose it a lot earlier. And I think what this is really telling us is that the human body is much more efficient at dealing with differences in energy intake when that energy intake difference is generated by exercise, not purely just starvation.
Yeah, I think it looks, you know, when we look at things like mTOR signaling, I mean, obviously exercise is going to, you know, sort of preserve lean muscle mass. And I think that's, again, I'm sort of continue to beat this drum about exercise being important, regardless if you believe it's going to make you lose weight or not. It's still such an important thing for lean muscle mass. And so,
yeah,
it makes sense. I mean, I would much rather eat more and do exercise and just starve myself and sit around. I mean, I just...
And to come back to you answering a question about what I did differently in the back third, I suppose, of a prep, is I came to a point where I either had to reduce my calorie intake or increase the amount of activity that I was doing. I just chose to increase the amount of activity. So I was doing more walks, or like I do things like you, where, you know, you're doing push-ups, 100 push-ups on the hour every hour. That I can't do 100, but like, you know, you just do something where you're consistently burning ATP throughout the day and trying to create the energy deficit that way. I found that was something that was very, very effective for me.
Yeah, and you know, like you said, even when you were coming down to it sounds like you're having, you know, you said half a pound 3 times a day, still a pound and a half of food. That's still relatively.
Oh no, sorry. I mean, the minimum that I'll eat at a meal is about a pound.
Yeah. Okay. So even when you're,
I won't even open up the fridge for less than that.
So even as you were getting lean down to, what did you get down to, like 12% body fat or something like that?
Yeah, it would have been like 12 to 14. I never got a DEXA scan, so it's hard to tell, but you know, like veins on the stomach and
yeah. So at that you were still eating what, 3 times a day, a pound at a time?
Yeah, between a pound and 2 pounds, generally speaking. And at the moment, I'm averaging about, I'd probably say about 4 pounds.
Yeah, that is, you know, I think most people would not equate that much food with that level of leanness. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I mean, you know, like I said, right now, leaning out my lean days, it's like 3 to 4 pounds still, which is, you know, by most people standing a lot of food. So it's kind of a fun.
Well, I mean, I generally eat a lot leaner than a lot of other carnivores, which means that I need to eat more food to get the energy that I need anyway. On top of that, I train twice a day, as I mentioned before.
Yeah.
So my energy needs are already higher. And I've kind of changed my opinion over time about which I think is better, the higher fat versus higher protein approach.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of my work was originally based on, protein overfeeding studies that showed that as you increase the protein percentage with pretty much no cap to it, the better the body compositional changes. But the truth is, having been down that path for a period of time, it's a U-shaped, upside down U-shaped curve. You do eventually reach a point where eating more protein, whilst it might result in better body composition per unit of energy that's eaten, it becomes unsustainable. And eventually you reach a point where you become so ravenous that you end up actually overeating the amount of food that you're aiming to do. And you would have just been better off eating slightly more fat in the first instance. And that actually captured my imagination. I started doing a bit of research into actually what causes fat to be satiating, and following that down the rabbit hole, just really trying to drill down. It actually turns out that certain fatty acids actually convert to a number of different compounds. In particular, one that's really interested me is an endocannabinoid called, God, I can't even pronounce it. It's OEA, oleoethyl amylide, something like that. And what's really interesting about it is it's actually a PPAR alpha, PPAR delta agonist. So those who don't know, PPAR is a perisome proliferation activation receptor or something. And what they do is they actually control energy homeostasis and substrate metabolism in the human body. So alpha controls your body's use of, I can't remember if it's fat or carbohydrates, but essentially as one receptor is activated, it forces your body to predominantly use that energy substrate. And this is actually how the Randall cycle is controlled inside of the body. When you have an excess of any one particular energy substrate, these receptors are activated, which then signals their uptake. The delta actually controls overall satiety, and gamma in itself controls the opposite to whatever alpha was. Again, I don't want to say it just in case I'm wrong, but I'm pretty confident the PPAR gamma controls fatty acid oxidation. What's really interesting is I've actually been supplementing with OEA. It's just a fatty acid ligand. You can buy it. It's expensive, but you can buy it just to actually trial to see what it does from a satiety standpoint. And what I've actually found is that it's heavily reduced my food intake. Why I think this is interesting for you guys is that OEA is actually produced by your body in response to certain fatty acids, in particular oleolic acid, which can be found in higher concentrations in ruminant meat versus other meats. And what's interesting about that is that it is a mechanism to explain why a high-fat diet is more satiating than a lower-fat diet, and also why certain fats can be more satiating than others.
Yeah, and when because when you were talking about high protein, I mean, you were really, I think you were probably, I think you said at some point 80-90% calories coming from protein, which is extremely extreme. I'm on I'm probably at 70% now because I'm cooking in fat and I'm still eating red meat, and it's even though it's sirloin.
It's when you say 70%, do you say 70% in terms of calorie?
Yeah,
because even 70% calories from protein is huge. Like, that's excessively high still.
Yeah, it's high. I mean, it's definitely high, but I mean, it's about a reverse of what I would normally eat, which would be 70% of my calories come from fat. This is ribeye steaks and stuff like that. So there's a point in the middle. Where do you find yourself fit good now? Because there's people that are wanting to eat ketogenic macronutrient ratios, and some people are at 80% or even higher fat and 20% protein. Or where do you find it works better for you currently?
I feel the best at around about 30% protein. I feel like I perform the best at around 50 to 55. And overall, I think I probably look the best in terms of lowest body fat and most amount of vascularity. getting up to around the 75%, in all honesty.
Yeah.
I've done it for a number of months. I don't want to be up around the 75 again. It's not a fun experience. You know what I mean? Like, you just, yeah, okay, it's great looking good, but at the same time, it's miserable. You know, you're constantly fighting off food cravings and anyway.
And this is a thing that I've found for me is, you know, how long were you going 70% or more consecutively?
Like 4 or 5 months.
Okay, yeah, because I find that I do it for 4 or 5 days and then I put in a fat refeed, and so I mean that to me is more sustainable. So I mean, you know, I might go 4 days eating this 70% range, and then on the fifth day, I'll bring back in the ribeyes and bring back the other stuff. Now the problem I had initially was I was like, okay, today's my fat refeed day. Let's just gorge on fat, and then you get to this overfeeding situation. So you have to kind of moderate it and say, okay, you put more fat in, but you don't gorge. You know, you just kind of find out what you need.
So I'll ask you this: well, in terms of percentage in mints, so 90%, 85%, whatever it is, where do you find that you feel the best and you perform the best, and where do you feel like the percentage best suits your body composition?
Well, I mean, body composition is going to, you know, to get leaner. And again, it's perform how. I mean, because when I was rowing, when I was trying to break records at 500-meter row, I needed to be a certain size and level of strength. And that required just being bigger. And to be bigger doesn't necessarily mean being leaner. And so I could pull a really, really good 500-meter row at 240, 250. Whereas at 230, where I'm at now, approximately, I'm going to be a much better CrossFit athlete.
So question about that as well, like you were on the ergometer, right? Like not in an actual boat. So I mean, I feel like if you were actually in a boat, there would be an advantage to being lighter because you'd have lower draft.
Yeah, I mean, it's a strength to weight ratio on a boat, absolutely. I mean, but most Olympic rowers are about my size. I mean, 6'5", 240, you know, 230.
Just really long draw in there.
Yeah, I mean, these guys are really tall. Some of them are bigger. Many of them are a little bit lighter. But I mean, there are plenty that are in that body type range. And so I'm kind of ideally built to be a rower with long limbs and that type of stuff. I'm just 53 years old, so I'm too damn old. But there is, for me, I feel like I'll say yesterday I did an exercise I've been doing for, you know, off and on for years. So I take this 150-pound ball and I set it up on a 60-inch box. I did 20 times as fast as possible, which is a pretty damn good conditioning exercise. If you've never done it, trust me, it's hard work. And the best I'd ever done it was like 2 minutes and 2 seconds. And this is even when I was doing, when I was 280 and stronger. And, you know, I remember I had a contest. It was me, a strongman competitor, and a guy in the NFL. And we were all we were loading that ball in the box. And I beat all the guys, you know, and these guys are, you know, I was probably in my mid 40s, early 40s back then. And, you know, because it's just a specialized skill and it's conditioning. And the NFL guys like, I don't want to hurt my back, you know, because he's hurt about his back. And the strongman guy, even though he'd been loading him, but I ended up, and that was like 2 minutes and 2 seconds. Well, yesterday I did 1:48, which was the best I've ever done in my life at a lighter body weight at age 53. So I'm still performing very, very well. And this is at a leaner level of body fat. So but what I'm doing is, like I said, I'm periodically refeeding myself. So I still have that energy. You know, I'm filling up probably, you know, because I'm doing it with fats, I'm probably restoring a little bit of the intramyocellular triacylglycerides that I use for some of my energy. You know, there's a difference, you know, there's that athletics paradox with fat deposition in the myocytes, you know, whereas we see that when we see these diacylglycerides and ceramides and other, you know, lipid depositions, that's usually associated with impaired insulin signaling and insulin resistance. And this is one of the things that plant-based diet people say fat causes you to be insulin resistant. Again, that fat is coming via de novo lipogenesis and not necessarily dietary fat, because the liver basically gets everything and switches, you know, takes the carbon atoms around and takes the acetyl-CoAs and starts to make either, you know, different fats, often palmitate, and, you know, or sometimes show into gluconeogenesis, depending upon what the body's needs are at the time. But So there's a difference between eating fat and what the liver's putting out. And what the liver puts out, there's a lot of palmitate floating around that can overload the mitochondria, and we end up with these incomplete oxidation products, which end up being deposited as these sort of problematic lipids in the ectopic regions, whether it's the liver, pancreas, muscle cells. So, but yeah, I mean, my performance is actually pretty darn good. You know, Phil is commenting on my technique, but me leaning back. Phil, I don't necessarily think you need to emulate my technique when I'm doing that. I mean, that is for a very specific purpose. I don't do that when I'm rowing distance. That's only for short periods of time when I'm trying to maximize my stroke power index for 20, 30 seconds, maybe a minute. So it's not.
So can I just confirm, sorry,
Yes.
when you say that you're eating 70% protein calories,
Yes.
What cuts of meat are you eating at the moment?
So it can be sirloin, and there's a company called Certified Piedmontese who makes meat that almost has no fat. They're Piedmontese cattle, they have a deficiency in the myostatin gene, so they get very muscular with very little. They have very little
intramuscular fats. The marbling.
Well, it's very little intramuscular fats, but they also have very little intramuscular fascia, and so it becomes very tender. So it eats like a much fattier cut. So it's palatable. And this is why, like I said, so I'll eat their fillets, I'll eat their sirloin. So I might get a fillet and it'll be 1.5 grams of fat and 25 grams of protein. That might be, maybe 3 grams of fat, 25 grams of protein. So you're seeing quite a bit of protein to fat. And then I'm eating fish. So I'm eating flounder, which is, again, 20 some grams of protein, a gram of fat. I am cooking it in a little bit of ghee, so I'm getting some added fat from that. So I'm guessing around 70%. Generally it it varies a little bit day to day. I'm not sitting there with a food scale or anything like that. But
so based on that and the experience that I've had with the number of clients eating ad lib, I'd expect you to eventually get down to about the 10 to 12% mark, with it slowing as you get leaner and leaner eating ad lib at those kind of percentages. I don't really see performance benefit for people who aren't weight restricted for a male below about that 11 to 12%. I think once you go lower than that, the trade-offs in order to get leaner don't match any potential performance increase that you might see.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think I'm probably right around that mark right now. I think I'm somewhere in that, that 10, I don't know if you look at my Instagram, you can see where I'm at. At least recently I'm somewhere, it's going to fluctuate. It's kind of funny. It changes very quickly. When you get that lean, it can change overnight, because you're already at a relatively low percentage. And like I said, I am doing it for performance. That's the whole. I'm not going to get up there on a bikini or whatever.
I think you look great in a bikini. Don't worry, mate.
Whatever the male equivalent of a bikini is, and get on stage. I've got no zero desire to do that.
A banana hammock.
Banana hammock. There you go. That's right. That type of thing. So anyway, well, gosh, we've been going an hour already. This has been really good, interesting stuff. I'm going to probably wrap this up. Let me know where folks can find out more about you, because you're a wealth of knowledge when it comes to performance in sort of with regard to, meat-based diets and that sort of stuff. So where can people find you?
So I'm predominantly on, if you actually look up there it is. I'm predominantly on Twitter under 2 Minute Keto. I'm not really in the coaching or anything else kind of space at the moment, just with COVID and everything else like that. I just don't really have the hours to go for it. But if you hit me up there, I'm almost always open to giving out advice or just, sharing my experiences that I've followed along the path. So by all means, come hit me.
And you said it was 2 Minute Keto. Is that what it was? 2 minute.
Yep.
2 Minute Keto. Is it?
Yeah, 2 Minute Keto.
2 minute. And you actually spell out the entire minute, not MIN. No, it's 2 minutes.
No, it is. Can you see that in my my video stream? You can see I've got it actually sitting up the top there.
Yeah, it's just inverted. It's just flipped around. So it's like.
Oh, is it?
It's
okay.
mirroring.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. 2 Minute Keto. Okay. So there's 2 and then there's a dash. 2 MIN dash keto. All right. Perfect. All right, guys. Well, Well, I've got push-ups and rowing to get to, so, and other stuff. Hopefully everybody enjoyed today's talk, and thank you so much. You guys have a good weekend. All right. Take care, everybody.
You too. See you later.
Bye-bye, guys.